Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to Surrounded by Soundscapes, which I recently realized I could have just called Supersonic. We have 3 supersonic guests here. So, it was the Canadian composer R. Murray Schafer who originally gave us the term soundscape, meaning all sounds that reach the human ear from a given place at a given moment. And as part of the public program series For Silence, I wanted to put together a program that explicitly considered sound with a very liberal definition of soundscapes as its guiding principle. This evening we're in the company of 3 people who are possessed by sound, 3 who are exquisitely thoughtful about its place in film, music, the world, in life, thoughtful about how sound is situated in landscapes and places and cultures, about how cliffs of silence and crescendos of sound can create and sharpen narrative. Preparing for this evening with Bernie Krause, Charles Amirkhanian, and Walter Murch has been a lot of fun. They've all been reviewing each other's work in preparation for it, and I've been along for the ride. So, let me tell you a bit about who they are. Bernie Krause, sitting in the middle, is a musician, field naturalist, and sound ecologist. He started out as a musician, including stints as a studio guitarist for early Motown sessions, performing with the folk group The Weavers, contributing to albums by George Harrison, Mick Jagger, and others, and releasing many recordings as half of the duo Beaver and Krause. His transition to his current career came about through an epiphany while he was recording Wild Sound to fulfill a commission from Warner Brothers, I believe. It happened at Muir Woods. For the first time, he realized he'd been using his ears to screen out noise rather than as portals to allow information to come in. And it changed his life. He's since become one of the world's experts in natural sound, cataloging over 15,000 members of the animal kingdom and building a library that currently contains about 4,500 hours of recorded natural soundscapes. He coined the term biophony, which means the collective sound of all the vocal organisms in a natural habitat, and his work has redefined the field of soundscape ecology. He's been getting a lot of play lately due to his book, The Great Animal Orchestra, which is coming out in paperback on literally days, March 12th, March 19th, March 12th. So you can get almost immediate gratification. Hear about it tonight, get it in a few days. Walter Murch, film and sound editor. His credits conjure up some of the most remarkable films of recent decades: The Conversation, The Godfather, Parts 1, 2, and 3, Apocalypse Now, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, Cold Mountain, and The English Patient, for which he received the Academy Award for both picture and sound editing. He wrote and directed the film Return to Oz and the book In the Blink of an Eye, A Perspective on Film Editing. Along with Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas and a few other renegade filmmakers from Los Angeles, Walter came to San Francisco in 1968 and created American Zoetrope, a place to make independent movies with atypical stories and actors and pioneering groundbreaking soundtracks. It was Walter and his colleagues who coined the term sound design, a new credit to describe a new approach in film. A true Renaissance man, when he is between films, he pursues interests in cosmology and the history of science. And he recently translated and edited a collection of stories by the Italian poet and novelist Curzio Malaparte. It's called The Bird That Swallowed Its Cage, and it was released by Counterpoint Press just this past November. Charles Amirkhanian, composer, percussionist, sound poet, radio producer, artistic and executive director of Other Minds, best known for its annual New Music Festival, which brings together musicians from around the world who are making contemporary expressions from local music and sound traditions. The 18th Other Minds Festival happened just last week, and Charles is still standing, so it must have gone well. Over the years, he has done He has brought us the richness and breadth of contemporary music, and for this reason I think we owe him great thanks. And he has done this as the director of the Speaking of Music series in San Francisco, and through leading the De Gerasi Resident Artist Program in Woodside, and as music director at KPFA from 1969 to 1992. His own work, recorded on labels including Starkland Records, 1750 Arch Records, and many other labels, incorporates both representational and abstract sound to create evocative, quasi-narrative compositions. His Walking Tune, a room music for Percy Grainger, is one of the most important examples of this genre. The CD that includes this piece, called Walking Tune, was released in 1998 by Starkland Records. Charles is going to be our moderator tonight, and we're doing this as a conversation between the three, and we will have a question and answer period as well. And when we do, please wait for the mic, because we're recording, so the mic is also a receiver. So please join me in welcoming Charles, Bernie, and Walter.
Thank you, Karen Bennett, and we're glad to participate in this education program as part of the activities of the Berkeley Art Museum, and great pleasure to be here with these two distinguished gentlemen. And it occurs to me that our careers began at a point in time, let's say in the 60s, 70s, when the facility we have now with sound wasn't available to us, and we had to do all sorts of workarounds. Walter, did you have special workarounds that you had to devise?
Yes, I think we were mixing in the early days on Folsom Street in San Francisco, and there was one echo chamber, which was a room like this with concrete walls, much smaller, but we had very little access to it because it was being used by Carlos Santana most of the time. But we could occasionally get in there. But it had just an echo chambery kind of sound, and I wanted more than that, and so I developed a technique of re-recording atmospheres that I called worldizing, playing back recorded soundtracks in the actual environment, a gymnasium or the bathroom or whatever. Today, that would all be done digitally, but in those days, very labor-intensive, but wonderful, actually, because of the kind of randomness that it would come with it.
I like the story about the 4 times faster recording that you did. Can you explain what that was?
That was another desperate attempt to get space. I discovered that with analog tape recorders, if you had 2 of them, you could take a sound that you wanted to treat and play it back at 4 times normal speed, so it would sound very chirpy, record it on another tape recorder, and then slow that tape recorder down by 4 times. What would happen is that you would, say, be recording this in your living room, so it would pick up the space of the living room, but when you slowed it down by 4 times, the acoustic space would expand by 16 times, so it would sound like the interior of a huge cathedral.
Why is that? I don't get it.
It's got something to do with basic physics, Charles.
That's why I don't get it. Bernie, did you have any workarounds that you had to do in the early days that seem absurd now?
Well, the Moog synthesizer that Walter was just talking about was a revelation to most people because it was exactly a synthesizer. And if you were going to synthesize sound like a trumpet or a violin or any other kind of instrument, you really had to pay some attention to what you were hearing and how to reconstruct all the components of that sound, including reverberation. And it was one of those rare moments in technology. It was a very transitional technology, but the way Moog developed this instrument, it allowed a wide range of capabilities for the artist and musician and sound designer to really do some interesting stuff, some filtering and processing of sound and so on. And really, it was an extraordinarily inventive and a great time.
It was, to learn about it, you had to learn about the kind of the inner articulation of basic sound. So it was kind of the sound equivalent of artists doing drawings in anatomy. You understood the bones behind every sound. It has an attack, a sustain, and a decay. And, it was a fantastic education for me in terms of just the bones that underlie all sound.
Yeah, and there was actually a group called Kanto's Expanding Headband. If you can get that record, do it. No kidding. It's really interesting because what these guys did was they synthesized the human voice and articulation of words. If you think it's really easy to do, try it on a Moog synthesizer one day. I mean, these guys really had it so that it was extraordinary.
Well, for me, in 1970, I remember working at KPFA, and the cassette machine had just become widely available to people, and we started something called the World Ear Project, where we asked people to send in recordings from all over the world, but not to alter the environment that they were recording. So we got people walking through bazaars in India with little microphones on their backpacks and just recording whatever came. And then we would play these on the air for 20, 30 minutes at a time with just an introduction as if it were a Schubert, sonata. And now we'll take you to Balpur, and here's this ambience that people are listening to there. And we had gotten the idea, I think, from a film sound man named Luc Ferrari, who had a portable Nagra, I think, and he did a lot of wild sound and sound recordings for film. And he started recording things at the beach in Yugoslavia. And just, I'll never forget when the Deutsche Grammophon recording of his Almost Nothing, #1, came out. Let me see if we have it queued up here. And this for us was a shock because it wasn't Central European avant-garde music, but it was on this wonderful label. And all he did was take a 24-hour trip through this Yugoslavian village and record whatever he found, including people and other sounds, but mostly natural sounds. And it was a shock to hear it on a classical LP. And it certainly turned our heads around in Berkeley. And Richard Friedman and I started this project, and we got submissions from all over the world. It was really wonderful to hear the inventiveness of people who could not alter an environment, but would just record whatever was there. And the results of some of those recordings are still available to hear on the internet on a website called radiome.org, where lots of KPFA programs are put up. But you can search on World Ear Project and you'll find water dripping into a cup, and it sounds like it was programmed to be all sorts of inventive pitch variations, but it's really just water dripping into a cup. And amazing how interesting that is. So I wonder, Bernie, you also started recording soundscapes yourself in the mid-'60s?
1968.
How did you do it at first? With what equipment?
Well, I used a small Ewer tape recorder. It had it had a 5-inch reels of tape, and the mics just at that point were beginning to be developed so that you could record outside with them and get some pretty good stuff. And so it just happened to be at the right moment. My late music partner Paul Beaver and I were doing an album for Warner Brothers called In a Wild Sanctuary. It required that we go out into the field and capture natural sound because we planned on using it as a component of orchestration. And so what happened was I had never been in the field before, so I went out with this recorder and went to the wildest place I could think of, and that was Muir Woods and the San Francisco Zoo. and tried to capture natural sounds at these very remote and distant places. And so the album, the soundscapes on In a Wild Sanctuary are, to say the least, modest, but they certainly made the point. And for me, as soon as I turned on that recorder and heard that sound, the soundscape open up and the sound field open up to that full 360 degrees that visual capture never allows us. The moment I heard that in October of 1968, when there are hardly any birds around, I didn't know that either, it changed my life. It was an epiphany that helped direct me in a way that I never looked back.
So the exploring you were doing was done with headphones on and a mic held out like this?
Yeah, a stereo pair.
So now how does that experience differ from just walking around and listening with two ears?
Well, that's a really good question, something that maybe Walter can answer even better than me. What it did is it just expanded the space in a way that was illusional. In the sense, it was what Walter calls the what was the word you used? I forgot the name. I'm just losing it right now. Anyway, he uses a term called a shadow sense. That's it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you reminded me. Yeah, and the shadow sense is sound, and when you hear this through earphones, you get a different kind of perspective because the microphones only pick up a certain limited perspective in the sound field. So that is impressive, and especially when you turn up the monitor level a little louder than the ambient sound around you, you get a very different impression of the sound, and you hear detail in a different way that you would ever hear with your ears alone.
Yeah, I learned that flushing a toilet because I used to record toilets from up here, and then I one day put the mic right inside the bowl. Wow.
Makes a difference.
That's a huge difference. So your sense of
Depends
scale,
what's in it.
Yeah. No shit. So your sense of scale is completely altered by the placement of the microphone. Do you use that in film work at all, Walter? Or do your people who work on films play with the scale of the sound by placement of microphones?
Sure. I mean, all the time. That's what your relationship is between the microphone and the sound itself is. It's kind of like it's the sound equivalent of a telescope, in that you can change the focal length, so to speak, of the sound itself. And it's true with how we record voices, and it's true with sound effects and obviously music. How close you are to an instrument, you pick up certain details when you're close to a guitar that you would never pick up farther away. In a sense, those tinier detail sounds don't have the trajectory of the larger resonance sound, so they drop off very quickly. So you can increase the detail and the granular structure of the sound, which can be, depending on the image that you associate it with, it can look more real, or it can have a disassociative. It can make you think something strange is going on here, and we use both of those techniques all the time.
Bernie, when you're walking around with headphones on, you can get surprised sometime, and in your book you mention an event that is really striking. Could you explain what happened with the Jaguar?
Oh, good grief. The Jaguar is a story about one night while working in the Amazon. I went out with my colleague and we were walking down the trail around midnight. And we noticed that we picked up the scent of the jaguar, but we couldn't see it or actually hear it because they're very quiet. And it was walking along in the woods along the path that we were also on. And at one point, my colleague went off in one direction, I went off on another, and set up my mics down the trail. And my mics were on a cable that was about 30 feet long. And I sat at one end of it with my recorder. And as soon as I turned on that recorder, the jaguar came right up to the microphone and began to growl in the mic. I had my earphones on, and I want to tell you, it was a frightening moment. You couldn't shine your flashlight, because to do that would frighten the animal, and you'd get attacked. And a jaguar is a very powerful animal, but it vocalized for about a minute, the longest minute I ever remember recording. And all of a sudden, as soon as it appeared, it just disappeared again, and it was off in the night.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story, because you are facing one direction and things are still happening in back of you, and in the dark, God knows what.
Yeah, I should say that I felt much safer than I would in Hollywood.
Really?
Yeah.
You have some soundscape stories you wanted to talk about. What do you have for us there?
Well, on the screen behind me are some disciplines that have been developed as a result of R. Murray Schafer's idea of the soundscape. And the soundscape touches so many of them. For instance, my field is music, which is why I wrote the book, The Great Animal Orchestra, because I wanted to show the connections between the natural soundscape and music. Just as easily, I could have focused on medicine, the way that soundscapes heal, and those groups that live more closely connected to the natural world go off into the forest for long periods of time to heal from contact, from the distractions of contact with the cash economies of the world that are beginning to intrude on their environments. I could have done my book on spirituality and the ways that the sounds of the forest informed us when we lived more closely connected. In terms of spirituality, there are many spirits in the forest. All of the sounds at night are spiritually oriented. So there are a lot of things I could have done: ornithology, natural history, all of the things behind me. And one of the connective tissue here on the stage tonight is between Walter and Charles and myself, is that we all deal in some way with organized sound. And the question that I try to deal with in all of my work now is, what are the roots of that organization? How did we come to organize sounds in the way that we do in our culture, in music, in sound design? And so one of the things that I found, certainly in music, for instance, if you take a look at this, think of this as a bar of music, actually. And it's actually 11 bars of music, but you can see this is from the lowest to the highest note from the bottom to the top of the page, and time is across the page from left to right. And you can see that the bass is here in the lowest end, and then the cello are a little bit above the bass, the harps here, the violins, and the flutes. And this is what that soundscape sounds like as played. The question is, how did we arrive at that kind of organization? Well, here's just a short excerpt from a soundscape. It's 10 seconds of sound from Borneo in Camp Liki, which is where Barudi Galdikas does rehabilitation of animals. And you can see, if you just think of this as the same bar of music, from the lowest to the highest note, and you can see that these animals have found niches for themselves, just like those harps and violins and cello and so on. You can see here that this cicada here has found 3 niches to vocalize in where its a voice can't be masked. Here's a Malaysian-eared nightjar here, coming in just a nanosecond after the cicada. You can see the chestnut-winged babbler here as well in another niche. They all stay out of each other's way, just like instruments in an orchestra. And then finally the gibbons down here. Insects are holding this long tone across here at about 8.2 kilohertz. And this is what it sounds like. To our ear, because it's untrained, and we live in a culture of total sonic chaos, to our ear, we don't make these distinctions, and it sounds chaotic to us. But look at this. you get the idea of how organization occurs in the natural world. And it needs to, because these animals wouldn't be able to hear each other if their voices were masked. I just want to briefly go over a couple of things here. This is not the whole story by any means, but one of the soundscapes that disappeared immediately after the Chernobyl destruction in 1986, the explosion, was the soundscape. It was very quiet for 3 years. And a few years ago, a colleague of mine, Peter Cusack from the UK, went back there and recorded the sound. And the only thing that's returned, humans can't live there yet, but the only thing that's returned is this rich soundscape. And listen to this. With the cuckoo in the background. The whole idea here is that soundscape gives us a lot. Soundscapes and biophony in particular, that natural sound that Karen was talking about in the introduction. Biophony is very important. It's one of the three components of soundscapes. The other two being the geophony, which are the natural sounds that are non-biological, like wind in the trees or grasses, water in a stream, or waves at the ocean shore. And what happens here is that, and the third is, of course, anthrophony, human noise, all the noise we make. Some of it is controlled, like music and sound for film or theater, but most of it is chaotic and entropic. Anyway, here's an example of something that's coming back, that's beginning to return in a way that's telling us that it's becoming more healthy, that was very much destroyed. Now, here's another example, a very short one, of a beaver that was recorded by a colleague of mine, Kurt Olson, in the American Midwest, in Minnesota, actually. And he was at this pond where he had been recording for many years. It was in a very remote area. There was no human habitation around, no farmland or development. And this ecosystem had been established pretty much by the beaver dam that held that pond together. And he was recording there one day. A couple of fish and wildlife guys came in, suddenly appeared out of nowhere, dropped a stick of dynamite down the beaver dam in the spring and killing the female and her offspring. And he sat there and recorded this sound of a beaver that I've never heard before. I mean, I've heard sound effects of beavers before, but nothing like this. As this animal was telling us and conveying emotion, which is very much a part of musical expression, by the way. But here's an example of this beaver swimming around, the male, which was wounded, swimming in circles, looking for its mate that night. I won't play the whole thing because it's just too, I can't stand it. We learned to dance. We learned to dance from the animals. Here's the first was a deer dance. Here's a buffalo dance. The next one is a bear dance from the Tlingit. And many of us want to know how we got our music. Well, the organization of music we got from the natural soundscape. Some of the actual music itself we got from, for instance, birds. Here's a musician wren that is from Mesoamerica down into the Amazon basin. And this musician wren sings these tunes, and at one point, whenever it's interrupted, it'll stop singing, wait till that interruption is over, and the parrot stops interrupting it, and then it'll go on and pick up where it left off. Here's the musician wren. Here comes the parrot. What? Guy never loses his place. Anyway, this is there was this guy, this French philosopher, who wrote this piece called the New Ecological Order. Came out in the early 90s, and he said, he says, nature is beautiful when it imitates art.
Yeah. Walter, do you buy these sound graphs that we saw as meaningful to each other, the orchestra and the African soundscape? Does that seem like proof to you that we write music the way we do?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It's just, it's remarkable to see those sort of parallels, and it's clear that, when somebody's composing music, that they're thinking about the same kind of separation of temporal and spatial separations that the music wren and the parrot were doing. And we do this in film all the time. The problem in mixing soundtracks is that there's always much more. We have many more sounds than we can fit in the sack of sound that we're dealing with. So we have to be selective and anticipate what the audience is interested in hearing, and what the balance of all those things are together, and what the dynamic range of it is, and the frequency range. A soundtrack ideally has a film soundtrack of including the music and the dialogue and all the sound effects is exactly similar to the kind of diagrams that you were looking. These things occupy that range, so they're not going to interfere with these. And could we please ask the composer to stay away from the low bass, or at least give us that in isolation, because then we can tuck it in and around the sound effects. And have that option for this kind of orchestration.
I wanted to ask you about a convention that I've been thinking about a lot, which is that in film and television, a lot of times a scene will still be going on, and then the sound from the next scene enters early. Who started that, and when?
I would say Fritz Lang in M, one of the first soundtrack in a German film.
It goes back that far.
Yeah. No, it's if you look at that film, which has no music, by the way, other than what Peter Lorre whistles, "The Hall of the Mountain King," I think. It's all dialogue and sound effects, and it's astonishingly well conceived and thought out, and it puts many of the films that we make today to shame. And yet here it was at the very dawn of the use of sound in cinema.
Which brings us to the mantis shrimp.
Right. Well, you may have eaten this fellow without knowing it, or you're going to eat him tonight. He's very delicious. And we'll get back to him in a second. I was writing an article a number of years ago and came up against a conundrum, which is that we have many nouns that talk about the act of looking. A look, a glance, a stare, a gaze, a glimpse, another gaze, a gawk, a goggle, gander, and so on. And I'm sure you could probably double this amount very easily. And yet, for the act of hearing, we have nothing. There is no noun that talks about what the act of hearing is, other than, in English, a kind of slang, which is, give a listen to this. But in terms of non-slang speech, there isn't any. So that is a conundrum. Why is that? Because listening is extremely important to us. And all of us do nothing, frequently, but listen to things. So I followed that rabbit hole down where it might lead. And here's another paradox, which is that we hear much more than we see. in the sense that we start hearing when vibrations are 25 cycles a second at the very bottom of this thermometer, and we stop hearing, some of us, way up in the 20,000s. So we hear 10 octaves or 10 doublings of sound. Whereas in sight, which is the electromagnetic spectrum, we only hear 1 octave. We hear from 400 to 800 trillion vibrations, from simply violet to red. So red light is exactly half of the vibrations of violet light. So everything that we see, that we're looking at right now, is contained within a single octave of light, whereas what you're listening to me now is crossed many octaves, and what I'm going to play to you now is a sort of forced example of what would the world sound like if we heard with the same compression that we saw. So there's 1 octave of visible light. We don't see ultraviolet or X-rays, although they're part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And lower than that, we don't see infrared nor heat, which go down below. Radio waves and all of that, we can't see them, but they're just as much part of the electromagnetic spectrum as light is. So there's this compression. There's Beethoven in 1 single octave. And now 10 octaves. So why are we so visual? I mean, we think of the world, take a look at this. All of our metaphors for understanding something have to do with vision, and yet we hear across a much broader spectrum than we see. So this is another part of that conundrum, which relates to why do we have so many words for the act of seeing and no official words for the act of hearing? Well, it's not that it's impossible, because this little fellow has the most powerful sight of any member of the animal kingdom that we know of. He can see across 4 octaves, not 10, but 4. He can see well into the ultraviolet and well into the infrared. We have 2 different photoreceptors, the rods and cones. He has 16. So the question is, evolutionarily, why did this develop for him? I don't know. I don't know the answer. Don't get too close to him, however. He has also the sharpest attack with his claw of any of these kind of animals, and it has the force of a .22 bullet if you get too close to him. If you have him in an aquarium, they have been known to break the glass of the aquarium with not only with their claw, but with the shock wave that comes with this sudden acceleration. So nature is abundant and has graced this mantis shrimp with eyes that are very abundant in their information gathering.
Bernie, didn't you discover that the snapping shrimp has a very loud sounding voice?
Yeah, well, the snapping shrimp is an interesting critter. It's probably the loudest animal, given its size in the animal kingdom. It's 1.5 inches long, and it has this large claw. One of its claws is very large, and it snaps it very fast. so fast that it creates a cavitation bubble.
Right, as does this shrimp.
Yeah. And when it explodes, it's 200 decibels underwater. A 357 Magnum in air is like, it's equivalent to like a 357 Magnum shot off at your ear. It's that loud. And the reason that they do that, I mean, they're a tiny shrimp and they really can't move very fast, obviously. But the reason that they do that is to stun fish. If you've ever taken a look at a fish, it has a lateral line that goes from the gill to the tail. This line that runs right across the whole side of the fish. That lateral line is made up of these little cells that pick up slight changes in pressure waves in the water. Really, it's ear. And when a fish comes within range of a snapping shrimp and it lets go with that pulse, the fish is stunned, and then the shrimp can move over slowly and grab a little bite of a caudal fin or dorsal or something like that, and have a meal.
But can they see?
Who cares?
Speaking of sight, we are conceived, we develop in the womb, and 4.5 months after conception, the hearing switch is turned on. Sight is not turned on. We live in darkness in the womb. Smell is not operative in the womb. Touch is a kind of a slippery, mucal feeling. But hearing is as fully articulated at 4.5 months as it will be later. So the child developing in the womb is a fully auditory creature. And so each of us in this room was born into consciousness. The developing fetus is a conscious being, developing a sense of the self and the world, such as it is in the womb, all through the process of hearing. And it's an extremely rich sonic environment that the fetus is living in. The mother's heart, the mother's breathing, the mother's intestines, the mother's voice, and the wall of the womb is just that thick, so the exterior world slightly muffled, but the exterior world has a vivid presence inside the womb. I just wanted to play you this sound, which all of us experienced as our first, the dawning of our consciousness was accompanied by this sound 24 hours a day throughout all of the remaining time in the womb. And it's extremely loud. The decibel level inside the womb for the fetus is 75 decibels, which is like riding in a car with the window down. So here we go. Then suddenly, upon being born, the child experiences something that it's never heard before, which is nothing. That consciousness itself is born in that almost industrial environment that you just heard. And then at the night after having been born, when the child is lying in the cot in the hospital, there's nothing. So a large component of our life, a vanishingly component in the modern world, is this quality of silence. And if you can put yourself back into your state of mind the way you were the day you were born, that silence has a threatening aspect to it, because what it means is Mom is dead. That pulse that has accompanied you ever since the beginning of your evolution is suddenly stopped. And for those of us who are parents, have been parents, will be parents, I think it's this fact that explains a large amount of the child waking up in the middle of the night, hearing this nothing, and then crying out, "Mom!" And Mom or Dad comes into the room, picks the child up, starts talking, jiggles it, and it's comforted back to the place where it can go back to sleep. It's sleeping. You put the child back in the cot. You creep out slowly. You close the door with a click, and then the child wakes up because it's quiet again. So we use in music and biophony and in film soundtracks, we use this tension between the acoustic world and the silent world, which has these deep roots in... Too loud?
Oh, it's wavy.
I'm wavy? Okay. Wavy gravy. The other thing that happens... I hear a heartbeat, a very fast heartbeat. Is this on? Yeah. The other thing is causality. Which is, in the womb, there is no causality. Sound just is, and you don't know the difference between yourself and the sound. You don't really, it's just it, the world. When you're born, these other senses kick on, primarily sight, and you start to begin to develop this idea that the sound is caused by something. Your mother comes in, and you start to see these strange things called lips beginning to move, and the voice that you have heard in the womb comes out of these lips. And so you begin to say, oh, that's what made the voice. And then later in life, you pick up a glass, and you drop the glass from your high chair, and it makes a lovely smashing sound, and you understand that that smash is caused by something. So again, in what we do, especially in film, is play with this concept of causality. What is causing that sound? Sometimes we don't know what it is, and there's a great deal of anticipation that comes with that. Other times it's simply obligatory. The door closes and we hear click, the footsteps, and all those kind of things. So there's a wide range of different causalities that we play with. And the third thing that you discover upon being born is this concept of space, because the world that you develop in is spaceless. But when you are born, you start to see, you start to realize that you yourself are limited in space. You reach out for your mother, but you can't grab her yet. She is distant from you, and you start to associate something of the quality of her voice across the room different than the quality of her voice when she's close to you, what we were talking about in terms of the granularity of sound. And things come from over here or over there. They are further away or distant. Certain rooms have a reverberant quality that other rooms don't have. So, again, what we do, especially in film, is manipulate this concept of space and articulate it to get the greatest meaning that we can out of the film. And the other mystery that might go some way to explaining some of these problems. These are what used to be called silver dollar words. That hearing is ontogenically old, meaning in each of us, it's the first of the senses that turns on. It precedes the other senses. So it is partly, I think, why music and what Bernie was talking about, this healing nature of sound, that when we go into a rich sonic environment, whether it's an anthropological richness like music or a natural richness like the forest, we're getting back to some echo of where we were when our consciousness first began to ignite, which was in a totally sonic environment, surrounded by sounds, complex sounds. So it's at the deepest root of ourselves as individuals is this taproot of sound. However, sound is phylogenetically young. It's, especially in mammals, to the extent that it's developed, it's the most recent of the senses. So that if you looked at the brain scans and appreciated how much of the brain is dedicated to processing vision, it's huge compared to the amount of brain dedicated to processing audio. So there's this tension between the 10 octaves of sound that we can hear and the relatively limited brain power that we use to dedicate to analyze that sound, and the single octave of vision that we dedicate this huge amount of our RAM, our CPU, to analyzing all of these different. So we suck out meaning out of visual very hungrily, and this banquet of sound is presented to us, and we do relatively little with this. This is not universal, obviously. Dolphins and bats have a huge amount of their brain dedicated to processing sound, and relatively very little to processing vision. So there are all these kind of tensions that are neurologically and environmentally very rich.
Do you think with the advent of avant-garde music techniques that people who experience those tend to listen more carefully? For instance, in Conlon Nancarrow's studies for player piano, he has something with 12 simultaneously different tempi arrayed on different ranges of the keyboard, so you can actually hear all 12 of them at the same time, but that's not something we're normally challenged to do.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It may be something that over the long haul, culturally, we could make a shift like that. Any kind of new music, and if you're not familiar with Chinese music and you're suddenly exposed to it, it doesn't sound like it's organized at all. And vice versa. I was just talking to some Indian friends yesterday, and they said the strangest sounds for them are Western opera singers, because of this idea of projecting a voice to 3,000 people is completely not only not done in India practically, but it's considered rude to do this. So the fact that they have had to develop, Western opera had to develop this kind of leather-lunged projection to Indians is like, please don't do this. And so it's what are you culturally used to? So.
Actually, Walter, at one point I was working with a group in the Amazon called the Hivaro. And the Hivaro live in the Amazon basin, and when they go off and hunt at night, they don't have torches or flashlights or any way to really see where they're going, and they go through these grids of biophony, and they're able to really determine where they are by a kind of aural GPS. And not only that, but they're able to track game through the forest at night. They can't see the stars because the canopy is too dense. But they're able to track game by subtle changes in that biophonic fabric that they're hearing. They're able to tell what animal is a quarter mile up the path and what direction it's heading in, and actually what kind of animal it is, whether or not it's worth a hunt. And so these kinds of subtleties in the soundscape of some humans that still live within the realm of that connection is still really important, and they use that almost as much as the visual acuity that gives them the same kinds of information.
And when they work at night, basically the visual is gone.
They don't see, and they don't trip over anything. They walk really quietly through that forest.
And you can't do that in New York City because you can't hear that far away, right?
Well, it's all entropic, all that noise. It's just chaos. And by that I mean I don't mean to denigrate our soundscape, although I don't like it very much.
Go ahead, Bernie.
but the idea is that this kind of sound, because it doesn't have any focus or organization to it, it really makes a difference in our lives. We don't know. We spend a lot of mental energy trying to derive information from that chaotic fabric. And that's one of the reasons when we go into a very noisy restaurant, we come out very tired. Actually, restaurants are designed to be stressful and noisy, so the turnover occurs very fast. Check that out next time you go into a really noisy
There was an interview with somebody who programmed music for restaurants to exactly this thing, and the interviewer said, "Isn't that kind of manipulative?" And the guy laughed and said, "Of course it's manipulative. My job is to put my hand in your pocket and extract money for as long as you feel comfortable with that."
Well, now that's interesting because when Muzak got started, they had continuous sound in grocery stores and other places where their service was done. And then they decided that there had to be 15 minutes of silence every hour so that people would be jerked back into the idea of purchasing with progressively faster pieces of music. And in fact, it was John Cage who decided to try to sell Muzak the idea of having, these were on 78 RPMs in those days, a 78 RPM with nothing on it, so that that silence would be the activator. And they laughed him out of the room, said, "No, we're not going to buy that idea." And it was 4:33 because the 78 RPM is 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And so later he devised that as a piece for David Tudor to play in a concert. But this idea of having alternating sound and silence is also important because I'm sure you use it a lot in film editing because you want silence to make the sound more impactful at certain places. I'd like to play an example of something I composed using bird sounds mostly. It was a piece called Im Frühling, in which nature sounds imitate an orchestra. But it was sort of the reverse of the tone poem of Smetana and Dvorak, where the orchestra imitates nature. And Carol and I were at a place on the Yucatan Peninsula where we stayed in a cottage, and in the morning, very early, we would be awakened by a bird who would land in a tree outside and start chirping away, and then another one over here, a different species, and so forth, all around. We were completely surrounded, and I couldn't believe how many different birds were there. That was just, and I'd never heard this before, so I tried to replicate this in the studio by taking single bird recordings and piling them up and trying to see how many I could put together that still would be audible. And by displaying them across the stereo spectrum, you get a kind of accumulation of these instruments, which are just birds. Let's see if we can hear that. Now, to me, this is very artificial, but Bernie spends his life in environments with probably more sounds than that at one time. And this is a later portion in the piece where I insert a cuckoo clock in juxtaposition with the birds. The idea. I wanted to play you one other example of, let me see if I can find it here. This is from a sound portrait of San Francisco called Metropolis San Francisco. And it uses sounds of I had all of the sounds that were peculiar to the Bay Area, like but we're not the cliche sounds like cable cars and so forth. So this is a sort of different look at the soundscape here, and it includes Asian television programs and all sorts of natural sounds in the mix. Not the example I was looking for, sorry. Okay, here we go. Sounds are taken from a television program in which a couple are slapping each other, something we never see on American television. You heard was the sound of a shower being activated at Carbon Hot Springs, and I laid it over these voices and didn't realize until later that people thought I was stir-frying this couple from the Asian film. But it brings up something that I often think about in Walter's work, which is that you will take a sound and have it very prominent in a piece of film, but it's not what you're looking at. The sound is not the object you're looking at. Could you give us some examples where you've done that?
Sure. It's the history of this goes way back. It was Eisenstein and Pudovkin in the late 20s who knew that sound was coming to film, and they wanted to produce a appropriate revolutionary way of artistically furthering the cause of communism, and decided that some kind of Hegelian dialectic between the sound and the image was good, that it wasn't just see it, hear it, but see something and hear something that was slightly at odds with what you were looking at, that the mind of the audience would then resolve this contradiction in a good way. And we are the inheritors of this fruitful idea. And Stalin hated this, by the way, and made them stop doing this. He just wanted see it, hear it kinds of sounds. But the example probably most people have seen is in The Godfather, just before Michael kills Sollozzo and McCluskey in the restaurant. You're looking at a restaurant, but what you're hearing, and increasingly loudly hearing, is a sort of arterial pulse of a sound that comes and goes and then comes back again louder and then goes away. And it's the sound of an elevated train, although that train has never been established in the film. It's only there present in a kind of abstract way because it's New York, it's the Bronx, and those trains do exist there. So I thought, well, I have the freedom to do that to the scene, but what I wanted to do was to have a sound that was objectively within the space in a kind of theoretical sense, but that didn't match what you were looking at, so that the mind of the audience says subconsciously, where's that sound coming from? And it gets interpreted by most people who don't even hear it consciously as reflecting some kind of interior state of Michael as he is getting ready to do his first close-up murders. And in fact, as soon as the gun goes off, this sound cuts off immediately. So it has an artificial end to it, which in a sense means that it was music, although we don't push that particular gas pedal at all. Then there's a brief moment of silence. The restaurant is stunned at what just happened, and he holds out his hand, as been told to do, and drops the gun. There's a clatter of the gun on the floor, which is see it, hear it, and then the music comes in very powerfully, taking you into the next scene.
We have a few minutes left. I wonder if we could have some questions from some of you who've been dying to ask. There's one over here from Margaret Fisher.
Okay, I'm leaving the good mics with the guys up front, so we'll see what happens.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I was surprised that the issue of time duration didn't come up in your discussion, and because sound and duration of sound are, I guess we take them for granted. I hope to form this question. I'm not sure I can get there, but on the way to the question is the idea of synesthesia and our concept of time and our perception of sound, or maybe I should say our perception of time and our perception of sound. And then I'm coming to this unknown possibility of conjuncture there from the idea that the poet Ezra Pound talked about absolute rhythm. And I believe that he was talking about perfect rhythm, the way we talk about perfect pitch, so that he had this ear for hearing duration. And he began to make rhymes in his poems from sound bits, from sound that was of the same duration. Although the sounds themselves were entirely different, and the meaning of the words were entirely different, and the words were entirely different. So there's a kind of abstraction going on. And I'm wondering if that time duration plugs into your ideas of how we perceive it, especially from the womb, where we're listening to time, duration of heart, and so forth, and of course not really conscious of what duration is. Then silence, and then we start to learn duration anew, or maybe it's not anew. What is this conjuncture of perception of time and perception of sound?
Do you have an idea?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'll have a go at that. Duration has, as your example with pound, has to do with rhythm. And this dominant rhythm, certainly in the womb, of the arterial pulse of the heart, which is roughly 60 beats per minute at rest in a healthy person, and it's not a coincidence that is exactly the 1 second beat, and much music is written at that rate. I think again we're going back to those things that started it all. Certainly in conjunction with image, there is that question of meaning and causality. I'm thinking of a sound in the beginning of the conversation where you're looking at an urban landscape, very much like Charles was playing, San Francisco with the cable car, and Union Square, 1972. Christmas, and I did everything in my power to evoke that world, and yet a certain number of seconds into that, once you'd gotten comfortable with that environment, there's this jagged sound that I made on the Moog synthesizer of some quasi-digital distortion. You didn't know what it was, but it kind of acoustically ripped through the soundscape that had been playing with no explanation. And the audience is left thinking, what was that? Is that a problem with the projector? Is it going to happen again? What caused it? So these questions are happening, and the nature of thought is that it takes time. That we presented with a new something, it takes time for us to think about these things, which relates to your question. And then my job as the sound designer of that film, at the right moment when the people have been thinking enough about this, and I was just using my intuition, then it happens again, which first then says it wasn't an accident, it wasn't the projector, this is an intentional sound. And now the audience is thinking, oh, that is going to recur. That is something that has a temporal element in the film. And then when that thought had been thought enough about, it happens again, and now it's linked with a causality. You're looking at something that conceivably could have caused that sound. So there are 3 steps in the duration, not only of the sound itself, but of the absence of that sound. Initiation, confirmation, and causality.
Were those sounds in any specific proportion? She's getting back to the absolute rhythm idea.
I can't answer that. I don't know.
Any other questions? Yes, over here.
Paul Matzner from Nature Sound Society. Very interested in this cultural difference that Bernie was talking about and Walter was talking about, and the way in which people behave and use sound in deep jungle atmospheres where they cannot actually see the prey, but also perhaps not even see each other. Do any of you know whether this is reflected in brain patterns or use of those brains? Because neurologists are finding that there's a lot of plasticity that we didn't know about in developing neural patterns and developing use of the brain. And also, in conjunction with that, is there any information about the way in which these deep jungle people use sound to project it through the vegetation in the same way as animals have to do? In other words, is there something in communication that goes along with that? That's kind of a bipartite question.
I can answer part of that, Paul. When working with primates, for instance, animals that beat out rhythms on the buttresses of fig trees and so on, these rhythms are signals that carry through the jungle a long way, sometimes a kilometer or two. And other groups will pick up those rhythms, and they carry significant amount of information in them, apparently. So people have learned that too, and they too will drum on the buttresses of fig trees. And one of the ways in which we might have learned to establish rhythm and texture, that particular texture, was by mimicking those expressions that carried that information. And I think that that's very much a part of it. I don't know how to answer your question in a complete context, because I don't think there really is enough study about just that kind of thing. Sound is very new, and soundscapes are very new. Sound is even new in film. It's hardly 100 years old. And the idea of how to express it in our culture. There are very few words that describe sound. There's a lot of stuff. I know when I used to go in and work on film scores with a lot of directors, they would come in and they say, we want something that's really dark in color here. We want that mood to be very light. They're always talking in visual terms to us. And because there are no expressions in our word lexicon to describe sound, which is why I've been working on that for the biophony and the geophony and so on, because I think it's really important to come up with new ideas to bring us into that sonic world and make it.
Well, the word soundscape was new at one time, wasn't it?
1977, soundscape.
And we don't talk about viewscapes in quite the same way, do we?
Well, landscapes, seascapes.
I mean, if you think of San Pablo Avenue as a viewscape, I think of it more as a soundscape.
I've got a great story, just a short one, and it is about the word soundscape. We were trying to get the national parks to do studies and to do some work with sound to try to preserve certain habitats so people could go in them and actually hear these areas. And we had it pretty well together in the mid 2004, 2005. And then the Senator Don Young from Alaska and Richard Pombo from California wrote a letter to the Department of Interior saying that soundscape was too much of a left-wing word. And they completely eliminated the word soundscape in their program. It's called the Natural Sounds Program.
Isn't Pombo from Fresno County, where I'm from?
Yes, he is.
Yes, I was afraid of that. There's no sound there.
He's your rep.
There's no there. Yeah. Anywhere up here?
Charles, I'm going to follow your direction. Who am I going to?
Right up. Raise your hand.
The question about duration and so forth made me reflect, and this is directed especially to Mr. Murch, that picture editing sometimes moves very, very quickly, I've noticed. But if you edited the audio at the same rate, it would seem very bizarre, wouldn't it?
Yeah. No, it's. I was just looking at one of these early films that Pudovkin and Eisenstein. This is a film directed by Pudovkin called The Deserter, made in 1932, and remarkably fastly edited film. I think.
Well, of course, that's pre-code.
Well, yeah, pre-Stalin, or he hadn't clamped down yet. But it's about a communist working in Germany who goes to the Soviet Union and sees the light, and probably one cut every 2 seconds. On average, over a long period of time, which is extremely fast even today. And yet the sound was this what they call asynchronous sound of impacts in a factory. It depends on what you mean by a sound, in the sense that in music, playing Chopin, there are tremendous number of quick sounds in the playing of a piano. Each one of those key impacts is a sound, and if you counted them up, they're probably, I would guess, 16 notes per second, even more sometimes. So it just depends on what you mean by sound, I think.
What was that film again?
The Deserter.
The Deserter, okay.
Right.
We've come to the end of our time.
I'll just say one other thing, which is speech itself. The atoms out of which speech is made are phonemes. The English language has 26 written letters, but 45 phonemes. The difference between the f sound and the t sound and the s sound. And human speech works at a rate of about 20 phonemes a second. That's the rate I'm speaking to you at now, and it's the rate at which we can understand speech. If you speak too much faster than that, it becomes unintelligible, and if it's too slower than that, you think some guy's on drugs or something. So there is a pace to the assembly of sound.
I saw George Lakoff leave just shortly ago, but I hear he did a wonderful appearance on Tavis Smiley today on language, which is very much similar to what we've been talking about with sound. So get to your computers and check it out later. And thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure visiting with you. Thank you.